The crystal chandeliers of the Metropolitan Museum of Art dripped light onto the city's elite. But for Eleanor Sterling, 7 months pregnant, the glare felt like an interrogation lamp. Her husband, tech mogul Richard Sterling, was at the podium, his voice a smooth balm of practiced charm. Everyone saw the perfect power couple. They saw the philanthropic husband and his beautiful expectant wife. But they didn't see the woman seated next to him on the dais, Chloe Rain, her hand brushing his thigh under the table. They didn't know the speech he was about to give wouldn't honor his wife but destroy her. The air in the Charles Engelhard court was thick with the scent of money and tuberose. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved like ghosts through the throng of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos, their silver trays laden with champagne flutes that caught the light and shattered it into 1,000 tiny diamonds. To any observer, Eleanor Sterling was the epitome of grace. Dressed in a custom-made navy silk gown that draped elegantly over her pregnant form, her honey blonde hair swept into a classic chignon. She was the perfect hostess, the perfect wife, the perfect ornament for her billionaire husband's arm. Her smile, however, was a masterpiece of engineering held in place by years of practice and a will of iron. Beneath the serene facade, a cold dread coiled in her stomach, a feeling that had become as constant as the gentle kicks of her unborn son. For months, the signs had been there, subtle at first, then growing as brazen as the man himself. The late nights at the office, he claimed, were for closing a deal with a Japanese tech firm. The lingering scent of a perfume, not hers, on his suit jackets. The second phone that was always kept face down, buzzing with a life she was not a part of. And then there was Chloe Rain. Chloe, the Senior Vice President of Global Strategy at Auratech Innovations, was Richard's magnum opus of a professional creation. She was sharp, ambitious, and devastatingly beautiful, with raven hair that fell in a sleek sheet to her shoulders and eyes the color of winter frost. She was everything Eleanor was not fierce. Where Eleanor was quiet, sharp-edged, where Eleanor was soft, a piranha, in a world where Eleanor had been raised to be a swan. Tonight, Chloe was seated at the head table, a place of honor, usually reserved for family or the most esteemed patrons. She wore a blood-red dress that clung to her like a second skin, a stark, deliberate contrast to Eleanor's understated elegance. A challenge. "Isn't she remarkable?" Richard had murmured to Eleanor earlier in the evening, his eyes following Chloe as she worked the room. A true visionary, she's the engine behind the new Helios project. Eleanor had simply smiled and nodded the practiced, placid motion of a woman who knew her role. She was the old money heiress, the Vance descendant, whose name had opened doors for Richard that his brash, new money genius never could have. She was the stable, respectable foundation upon which he had built his empire, a foundation he now seemed eager to drill into to test for cracks. Throughout the dinner of seared scallops and filet mignon, she watched them. It was a painful, self-flagellating exercise. She saw the way Richard's body was angled toward Chloe, even as he spoke to the mayor on his other side. She saw the shared glances, the conspiratorial smirks, the electric current that passed between them when their hands accidentally brushed as they both reached for a wine glass. The room was filled with over 300 people, but as far as Richard was concerned, there were only two, him and Chloe. Eleanor placed a protective hand on her belly. The baby kicked, a small, insistent reminder of the life she was carrying, the future she had so carefully planned. She had met Richard 7 years ago. He was a whirlwind of ambition and charisma, a man who saw her not just for her beauty or her family name, but for her quiet intelligence. He'd listened to her ideas about sustainable tech incorporated, her insights into his early business models. He made her feel seen. He had courted her with a relentless, all-consuming passion that had swept her off her feet. Their wedding was the society event of the year, a merger of old-world legacy and new-world innovation. They were supposed to be a dynasty. Now she felt like a relic, a placeholder. The polite smile she offered to a passing acquaintance felt brittle, as if it might shatter and reveal the screaming frustration beneath. She remembered the conversation from 2 nights ago, the one that had solidified her decision. She had found a receipt for a suite at the Baccarat Hotel dated for a night. He was supposedly in a board meeting until 3 a.m. When she'd calmly confronted him, he hadn't even bothered to craft a convincing lie. "Ellie, you're being emotional," he'd said, his tone dismissive, as if speaking to a child. "It's the hormones. Chloe and I were hashing out the final details of the Helios launch. We needed a secure off-site location. It was purely business." He'd tilted her chin, up his thumb, stroking her jaw. "You're my wife, the mother of my son. Don't ever doubt that." But it was the way he said it, not with reassurance, but with a veiled threat. "You're the mother of my son, so you will play your part. You will not make a scene." He wasn't calming her fears. He was managing a potential PR problem. That was the moment the last vestiges of love had crumbled, leaving behind something cold, hard, and terrifyingly clear. He didn't love her. He managed her. She was a strategic asset, and her value was depreciating. The clinking of a spoon against a glass brought her back to the present. The CEO of the Museum Foundation was on stage thanking their premier benefactor, her husband, Richard Sterling. A warm, polite applause filled the vast, sculpture-filled court. Richard stood up, buttoning his Tom Ford tuxedo jacket. He gave Eleanor a quick, performative smile, a husband's loving glance for the cameras and the crowd. It was so perfectly executed, it made her stomach turn. He walked to the podium, radiating the effortless confidence that had captivated investors and the media for years. "Thank you, Arthur." He began, his voice resonating through the state-of-the-art sound system. "It's an honor to be here tonight supporting the vital work of this institution." He spoke for several minutes, weaving a charming narrative about art innovation and civic duty. Eleanor barely heard the words. She was watching his eyes. They kept flitting back to the head table, back to the woman in the red dress. Chloe was looking at him with an expression of pure adoration. Her lips parted slightly. It was a private moment, made grotesquely public. Building a company like Auratech. Richard continued, his voice, taking on a more personal, reflective tone, "is not a solitary endeavor. It requires vision, yes. It requires capital. But more than anything, it requires a muse. A spark. A person who challenges you, who pushes you beyond your limits, who sees the future not for what it is, but for what it could be." Eleanor's heart began to beat, a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She knew what was coming. The dread that had been her companion for months was about to step into the spotlight. This was it. He was actually going to do it. Here, in front of everyone. In front of their friends, their business partners, the society that had watched their every move. He was going to humiliate her on the grandest stage imaginable. She took a slow, deep breath, her hand never leaving her belly. The gilded cage was about to break. The room was wrapped. Richard Sterling had a gift for public speaking. It was a magnetic, almost hypnotic quality that had swayed boardrooms and captivated conference halls. He paused for effect, letting the weight of his words settle over the 300 assembled guests. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of New York City traffic. Eleanor felt 1,000 pairs of eyes on her, expecting a loving gaze, a blush of wifely pride. Instead, she kept her expression perfectly glacially neutral. Her blood ran cold. For the past 2 years, Richard said, his voice dropping to an intimate, almost conspiratorial level. "I have been fortunate enough to have such a person by my side. Someone whose brilliance is matched only by their passion. Someone who isn't afraid to tell me when my ideas are terrible, and who has the genius to make the good ones truly revolutionary." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the standard philanthropic speech. This was personal. Eleanor saw Mrs. Vanderbilt Astor, a society doyenne, whose opinion could make or break a reputation, lean in to whisper to her neighbor. Eyes started to shift subtly at first, from Richard at the podium to Eleanor, and then with dawning comprehension to the woman in the scarlet dress. Chloe Rain, for her part, looked down at her lap with a feigned modesty that was more provocative than any overt display. A small, knowing smile played on her lips. She was soaking it in this public coronation. This was her victory lap. Eleanor's gaze locked onto her husband's face. She saw the slick arrogance, the self-satisfaction. He was enjoying this. It wasn't just an affair. This public declaration was a power play. He was rewriting their narrative in real time, demoting her from partner to spectator in the story of his life. He was establishing a new queen in his court right before the eyes of the old one. He believed she was trapped, constrained by decorum, pregnancy, and her financial dependence on him. He believed she would sit there and take it just as she had taken everything else. This person is the driving force behind the Helios project, a revolutionary leap in sustainable energy that Auratech will be launching next quarter. Richard announced, his voice swelling with pride. A project that will not only redefine our company, but will genuinely change the world. It is a testament to her vision, her tenacity, and her spirit. He raised his champagne glass. So, I want to propose a toast, not just to the future of technology, but to the architect of that future. To a true partner, a brilliant mind, and an inspiration. To Ms. Chloe Rain. The name hung in the air, a grenade with the pin pulled. A wave of shock, thick and palpable, washed over the room. There was a beat of stunned silence. Then a hesitant, scattered applause began, mostly from the Auratech employees seated at their corporate tables. Most people simply stared, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths, their eyes wide. They looked at Richard, then at Chloe, who now raised her head, her eyes shining with triumph. And then everyone looked at Eleanor. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing in on her, stealing the air from her lungs. It felt like a spotlight had narrowed to sear her skin, exposing her, the foolish pregnant wife, publicly discarded for a newer, shinier model. She could feel the pitying glances, hear the unspoken judgments. Poor Eleanor. How could she not have known? So embarrassing. The buzzing in her ears grew louder, and for a terrifying second, she thought she might faint. But then, she felt it again. A firm, definite kick from within her womb. It was a jolt, a reminder. This wasn't just about her. It was about the child she was protecting, the future she had a duty to secure. The shame and the hurt receded, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. It was a cold, clarifying anger that burned away the fog of denial she had been living in for so long. He had miscalculated. Richard, the master strategist, the man who prided himself on reading people, had made a fatal error in judgment. He had mistaken her quiet dignity for weakness. He had mistaken her patience for passivity. He thought she was a decorative swan, but he had forgotten that swans, when protecting their young, can be vicious. They can break a man's bones. As Richard beamed, basking in the awkward applause and Chloe's adoring gaze, Eleanor made a decision. Her carefully constructed plan, the one her lawyer had advised her to execute privately and quietly, was no longer sufficient. Richard had chosen a public stage for his betrayal, and so she would choose a public stage for her retribution. He wanted to burn down their life together in front of an audience. Fine. She would make sure he was the only one who got incinerated. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her napkin on the table. She pushed her chair back, the sound scraping loudly in the suddenly quiet room. All movement, all whispers ceased. Every eye was now fixed on her. Richard's smile faltered for the first time. He watched her, a flicker of confusion, then annoyance crossing his face. What was she doing? She was supposed to sit there, smile graciously, and endure. Eleanor stood up, her posture regal, her hand resting on the swell of her belly. She was no longer just a wife. She was a mother, a protector, a Vance. The blood of generations of shrewd, resilient men and women ran through her veins. She felt a profound, almost transcendent calm settle over her. She turned to face her husband, her expression unreadable. Then she turned her gaze to the microphone on the smaller lectern next to the main podium, the one reserved for brief remarks from the co-host. She started walking toward it. One step, then another. The sound of her heels on the marble floor was like the ticking of a time bomb. The walk from her chair to the lectern felt both instantaneous and eternal. Each of the 20 steps was a lifetime. She could feel the collective gasp of the city's elite, a silent, unified intake of breath. This was not in the program. This was a breach of protocol so profound it bordered on social anarchy. Richard's face had morphed from smug satisfaction to tight-lipped fury. He started to move toward her, to intercept her, to whisper a harsh command to sit down, but he was too late. She was already there. Eleanor reached the lectern and adjusted the microphone. The metallic coolness, a grounding sensation against her fingertips. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't look at Chloe, whose triumphant smirk had vanished, replaced by a mask of wary confusion. Instead, she looked out at the sea of faces, staring back at her, a gallery of the most powerful people in New York. Her people, the ones who had known her grandfather, who had done business with her father, the ones who understood legacy. "Good evening," she began, her voice perfectly steady, carrying a quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. There was no tremor of tears, no hint of hysteria. There was only ice. Richard is a gifted storyteller. He has just told you a story about a muse, an architect of the future. It's a compelling narrative, but like so many of the stories he tells, it is at its core a work of fiction. A shocked murmur rippled through the room. This was no longer just a social faux pas. It was a declaration of war. Richard stood frozen by the main podium, his face ashen. He looked like a man who had just watched his prize racehorse bolt from the starting gate and run directly into the stands. "My husband speaks of the brilliance behind Auratech's new Helios project." Eleanor continued her gaze, sweeping across the audience, meeting the eyes of investors and board members. "He's right to praise it. It is a work of genius. However, the architect of that project is not Ms. Rain." She paused, letting the implication land. The intellectual property, the core patents for the Helios energy storage system, were not developed within Auratech. They were developed by and are solely owned by a private research company called Vance Innovations. She saw a flicker of recognition in the eyes of a few older venture capitalists. Vance Innovations was her father's legacy, a boutique R&D firm he had established, which had become largely dormant after his death. Before he passed away, my father was working on this very technology. I continued his work. For the past 3 years, I have personally funded and overseen its development. Last year, I licensed the technology to Auratech, my husband's company, under very specific, and I must say, very favorable terms, believing it was the best way to bring my father's vision to light. She finally turned her head and looked directly at Chloe. The younger woman's face was a mess of disbelief and dawning horror. Ms. Rain is a talented project manager. She has done an admirable job of overseeing the implementation of my technology. For that she is well compensated. But a muse, an architect, no. That is a lie. The room was utterly silent. The air crackled with tension. But Eleanor wasn't finished. This was just the preamble. The main event was yet to come. She turned her attention back to Richard. My husband also spoke of the capital required to build his company. He has always cultivated the image of a self-made man, a visionary who built an empire from scratch. This too is a carefully constructed fantasy. She let her hand rest protectively on her stomach. When we were married, my family established a trust, the Vance Family Legacy Trust. It was designed to protect the remainder of my family's fortune. Richard, with his acclaimed financial acumen, was named the managing trustee. Her voice dropped slightly, drawing the audience in closer. The terms of the trust were simple. Richard was to manage the funds, to make them grow. But there was one critical, non-negotiable stipulation put in place by my father to ensure the continuation of our family line. It is an archaic clause, perhaps, but a legally ironclad one. The stipulation states that upon the birth of my firstborn, direct heir, full and unconditional control of the entirety of the trust, including all assets, holdings, and any ventures funded by its capital, reverts directly to me. The mother. She saw the exact moment the blood drained from Richard's face. He understood. His house of cards was collapsing. What the public, and indeed what most of Oratech's board doesn't know, Eleanor announced, her voice ringing with clarity, is that Oratech was not funded by venture capitalists. The seed money, the crucial first round and second round financing, $150 million to be exact, was drawn directly from the Vance Legacy Trust. It was a loan from my trust to his ambition. She looked out at the stunned faces. It was a loan that made him a majority shareholder, a loan that gave him his power, a loan whose primary collateral is that very stock that for the past 7 years has legally resided inside my family's trust. She took a deep breath, delivering the final devastating blow. As you can see, she said, her voice softening as she lovingly patted her prominent baby bump. My firstborn heir is due in 8 weeks, which means that in 8 weeks, or possibly sooner, I will become the sole administrator of the Vance Legacy Trust. And as such, I will assume control of its primary asset, a 51% majority stake in Oratech Innovations. She looked directly at her husband, the man who had tried to break her. A faint, cold smile touched her lips. So, I'd like to propose a toast of my own, she said, raising an imaginary glass. To my husband, Richard. Thank you for your 7 years of service as the interim manager of my company. Your position is terminated, effective immediately. The silence that followed Eleanor's final words was not merely an absence of sound. It was a living entity, a physical pressure that seemed to suck the very air from the room. It was the sound of 300 fortunes being mentally recalculated, 300 social maps being frantically redrawn. For a full 10 seconds, the world stood still. Then chaos erupted. It started not with a shout, but with a sharp metallic clatter. A woman at a nearby table had dropped her fork, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous hall. That single noise broke the spell. A cacophony of gasps, frantic whispers, and the scraping of chairs broke out as people turned to their neighbors, their faces alight with a mixture of shock, horror, and undisguised glee. The charity gala had just become the most explosive spectator sport in Manhattan. Richard Sterling stood by the podium as if he'd been turned to stone. His face, usually a mask of confident charm, was a canvas of raw, unfiltered shock. His mouth was slightly agape. His skin had taken on a pale, waxy sheen under the expensive lighting. He looked at Eleanor, not with anger, but with a profound, terrifying bewilderment, like a chess master who had just been checkmated by a pawn. He had played what he thought was his winning card, only to discover she held the entire deck. Chloe Rain, however, reacted faster. Her face, a moment before flushed with victory, was now contorted with panic. Her eyes darted around the room, seeing the stares, the pointing fingers, the smirks. Her public coronation had become a public execution. She wasn't the powerful muse. She was the foolish mistress, the home wrecker who had bet on the wrong horse and was now about to be trampled. She pushed her chair back, a choked sound escaping her lips, and fled. She didn't run, but she moved with a desperate, clipped pace. Her red dress a streak of shame as she navigated the maze of tables and disappeared through a service exit. Eleanor watched her go with a detached sense of pity. Chloe was a casualty, but she was not the target. The target was still on the stage, trying to reboot his shattered reality. Ignoring him completely, Eleanor turned and walked back toward her table with the same deliberate, unhurried grace with which she had approached the stage. The path cleared before her as if she were royalty. People shrank back, their whispers dying as she passed. She reached her seat, picked up her small beaded clutch from the table, and turned. A man was waiting for her at the edge of the dais. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, with sharp features and an air of quiet intensity. This was David Chen, her lawyer partner at the prestigious firm of Chen Wexler and Associates. He had been seated at a discreet table near the back, waiting for her signal. He hadn't expected this public display, but his expression was one of calm professional approval. "I assume the quiet approach is off the table," he murmured, his voice low and wry. "Richard chose the venue." Eleanor replied, her own voice cool and even. "I simply chose the closing act." David nodded, a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. "Well played, Eleanor. Shall we?" He offered her his arm. As she took it, Richard finally broke from his stupor. "Eleanor!" He roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. The charming CEO was gone, replaced by a cornered animal. "You can't do this. What the hell do you think you're doing?" He lunged toward her, his face a mask of fury. But before he could reach her, two uniformed security guards, summoned by the museum's event coordinator, stepped firmly in his path. They didn't touch him, but their presence was an immovable wall. Eleanor didn't even flinch. She paused and looked back at her husband, her expression devoid of all emotion. "I'm securing my child's legacy, Richard," she said, her voice clear enough for those nearby to hear. "Something you were clearly unfit to do." With that, she turned and on David Chen's arm walked toward the grand exit. The whispers followed her, a wave of speculation and awe. She had not just exposed an affair, she had orchestrated a corporate coup in the middle of a black-tie dinner. She had not just left her husband, she had seized his empire. As they stepped out of the museum and into the cool night air, the flashing lights of paparazzi, alerted by a sudden exodus of texting guests, erupted in their faces. David shielded her, guiding her toward a black town car that purred at the curb. "Change of plans," David said to the driver as they settled into the plush leather seats. "Take us to the Auratech building." Eleanor looked at him, surprised. Tonight, David confirmed, pulling a file from his briefcase. "You didn't just make a social statement, Eleanor. You made a legal declaration of intent. He will be at his office within the hour, trying to shred documents, transfer funds, and rally the board. We need to strike now while he's still in shock. We serve the injunction tonight. We lock him out of the system. We take control before he can even begin to fight back." Eleanor leaned her head back against the seat, the adrenaline of the past hour finally beginning to recede, leaving a profound and weary clarity. The gilded cage was gone, but the battle was just beginning. She looked out at the glittering lights of the city flashing past the window. They no longer looked menacing. They looked like they belonged to her. The Auratech building was a monument to Richard's ego, a sleek, 50-story behemoth of black glass and steel that stabbed at the midtown Manhattan sky. When Eleanor's car pulled up to the entrance, the lobby was in a state of controlled chaos. Word had traveled faster than the speed of light. Security guards were huddled together, speaking into their radios, while a few late-working junior executives stood in stunned groups, staring at their phones. David Chen, holding a thick, leather-bound portfolio, led the way. He was no longer just Eleanor's lawyer, he was her general, and this was the opening salvo of their campaign. They were met at the security desk by two grim-faced men in suits, members of a private security team David had hired that afternoon. "Mr. Sterling is not here yet," the lead guard, a former police detective named Frank, reported. "But his head of IT, Peter Gleason, is on his way up to the executive server room." "Stop him," David commanded without hesitation. "No one accesses the servers. No one enters or leaves the executive floor without my or Mrs. Sterling's direct authorization. We have a temporary restraining order effective immediately." He handed a copy to Frank, whose eyes scanned the document and widened slightly. They took a private elevator directly to the 50th floor. The doors opened onto a space designed to impress polished marble floors, sprawling modern art, and a panoramic view of the city. At the far end, behind an imposing set of glass doors, was Richard's office. Eleanor could see his personal assistant, a young man named Liam, frantically packing boxes. When Liam saw her, he froze his hands, hovering over a stack of files. "Mrs. Sterling, I didn't know." "It's all right, Liam." Eleanor said, her voice gentle but firm. "You can stop what you're doing. Nothing leaves this office." Moments later, the elevator doors opened again with a violent ding. Richard stormed out, his face a thunderous mask of rage. He was flanked by his own lawyer, a notoriously aggressive corporate litigator named Julian Croft. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard snarled, his eyes blazing. "You have no right. This is my company." "On the contrary," David Chen stepped forward, placing himself between Richard and Eleanor. "According to the binding articles of the Vance Legacy Trust, which you yourself signed and have administered for 7 years, this is now her company. This order." He held up the document, "prevents you from accessing any company assets, funds, or proprietary data. You are officially on administrative leave pending a full transition of control." "This is insane. It won't hold up in court for 5 minutes," Julian Croft blustered, stepping forward. "The trust's provisions are antiquated and can be contested on grounds of spousal coercion and undue influence." David smiled, a thin, bloodless smile. "Feel free to try, Julian. But while you're filing your motions, my forensic accounting team will be going through every transaction Richard has made for the past 7 years. I'm particularly interested in the shell corporations used to finance his personal projects, like the penthouse apartment he keeps on the Upper East Side, and the exorbitant consulting fees paid to one Chloe Rain, which seem wildly disproportionate to her industry-standard compensation." Richard paled. The threat was clear. This wasn't just about control of the company, it was about potential criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. "Get out," Eleanor said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a shard of glass. She was looking directly at Richard. "Get your personal effects and get out." For a moment, he stared at her, a tempest of emotions swirling in his eyes, rage, betrayal, and something that looked almost like pleading. He had always seen her as an extension of himself, a beautiful object that confirmed his status. To be confronted by her as a superior, an adversary with absolute power over him, was a complete system shock. His entire worldview had been shattered. Defeated, he turned and walked into his office. He didn't pack files or look at his computer. He walked to the bar, poured himself a tumbler of scotch, and downed it in one go. Then he grabbed a framed photo from his desk, a picture of him and Eleanor on their wedding day. Smiling, and with a cry of pure frustration, hurled it against the wall. The glass shattered, echoing the ruin of his life. He then walked out, brushing past them, without another word, a fallen emperor leaving his conquered palace. The days that followed were a brutal, fast-paced war fought not on a battlefield, but in press releases and boardrooms. Richard, through his lawyer, launched a vicious smear campaign. The tabloids were fed stories painting Eleanor as a vindictive, hormonal, and mentally unstable, scorned wife, using her pregnancy as a weapon to steal a company she didn't understand. They claimed she was being manipulated by her shark of a lawyer, David Chen. But Eleanor and David were prepared. They countered every attack with cold, hard facts. They released a carefully redacted summary of the trust agreement to major financial newspapers, proving her legal standing. They arranged an exclusive interview for Eleanor with a respected female journalist from Forbes, where Eleanor didn't speak of betrayal or infidelity. Instead, she spoke with passion and incredible detail about the Helios technology she had developed, her father's legacy, and her vision for a truly sustainable future for Auratech. She wasn't a wife seeking revenge. She was a visionary reclaiming her birthright. She convened an emergency board meeting. The members, initially loyal to Richard, were wary and skeptical. But when Eleanor, flanked by David and a team of patent attorneys, walked them through the undeniable chain of ownership for the Helios patents, the technology on which the company's entire future valuation rested, their allegiances shifted. They were businessmen, and Eleanor Vance, soon to be Eleanor Sterling, no more now represented the only path to securing their investments. By the end of the meeting, the board voted unanimously to officially install her as interim CEO. The battle for control was over. The war, however, had just entered a new, more dangerous phase. Richard was cornered, and she knew a man like him would not go down without a final desperate fight. Losing control of Auratech was a blow to Richard's finances. Losing the public narrative was a mortal wound to his ego. He became a pariah overnight. Invitations were rescinded, calls went unreturned, and business partners suddenly became unavailable. He was a king without a kingdom, and the humiliation festered, metastasizing into a dark, obsessive need for revenge. If he couldn't have the company, he would destroy the woman who took it from him. His strategy shifted from legal challenges to personal destruction. Since he couldn't prove she was incompetent, he would try to prove she was an unfit mother. It was a vile, desperate gambit orchestrated by his lawyer, Julian Croft. They filed an emergency motion for custody of the unborn child, citing Eleanor's erratic and emotionally volatile behavior. The centerpiece of their claim was a series of fabricated incidents and twisted half-truths designed to paint her as dangerously unstable. The official filing was a work of malicious fiction. It alleged she had a history of depressive episodes, mischaracterizing her grief after her father's death. It claimed her corporate coup was evidence of a manic state, a reckless act that jeopardized the company and, by extension, the child's financial future. The most venomous part was a sworn affidavit from a concerned party who claimed to have witnessed Eleanor drinking alcohol and engaging in stress-induced hysterics. Eleanor read the documents in David Chen's office, her hands trembling slightly. It wasn't the legal threat that shook her. David had assured her it was baseless and would be thrown out of court. It was the sheer personal cruelty of it. Richard knew about the deep depression she'd suffered after her father died. He had been the one to help her through it, or so she'd thought. Now he was twisting her most vulnerable moments into weapons to be used against her to try and take her son before he was even born. "Who is the concerned party?" she asked, her voice tight. "Who would sign this?" David's expression was grim. "We subpoenaed the identity of the affiant. It's Chloe Rain." "Of course." It was a final act of loyalty from mistress to master, or more likely, a desperate attempt to curry favor and secure a financial lifeline from the man she had hitched her wagon to. Chloe, who had been fired from Auratech on Eleanor's first day as CEO, was now unemployed and a social outcast. She had nothing left to lose. "He's trying to break you." "Eleanor," David said, his tone serious, "this isn't about winning. He knows he'll lose. This is about dragging you through the mud, about inflicting as much pain as possible. The hearing is in 2 weeks. It will be a circus." For a moment, Eleanor felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She was 8 months pregnant, running a multi-billion-dollar company in the midst of a hostile takeover, and now she had to fight for the right to be a mother. She felt the baby kick a strong, steady presence. The weariness vanished, replaced by a familiar, steely resolve. "He wants a circus," she said, her eyes hardening. "Then we'll give him one he'll never forget." That evening, Eleanor received an unexpected call. It was a blocked number. When she answered, a hesitant voice spoke. "Mrs. Sterling, it's Liam, Mr. Sterling's former assistant." Eleanor straightened. "Liam, is everything all right?" "No." "Yes." I don't know, he stammered, his voice fraught with anxiety. I shouldn't be calling, but what they're doing, what he's making Ms. Rain say, it's wrong. It's all lies. He took a shaky breath. And there's more. Something you need to know. The night of the gala, when Mr. Sterling came back to the office, he wasn't just grabbing a photo. He went to the hidden safe behind the bookshelf. He took out a ledger, a black moleskin notebook. He always called it his insurance policy. Eleanor's mind raced. A hidden safe. An insurance policy. What was in it, Liam? I don't know for sure, he whispered, but I overheard him on the phone with Mr. Croft. He said it had everything on the off-ledger payments. The kickbacks from the cobalt supplier in Congo, the bribes to the zoning commissioner for the new data center, everything. He said if he was going down, he'd burn the whole system to the ground. Eleanor's blood went cold. This was bigger than a corporate dispute. This was serious, widespread criminal activity. Richard wasn't just an embezzler. He was a racketeer. Why are you telling me this, Liam? She asked quietly. Because you were always kind to me, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And because my sister is a single mother. Seeing what he's trying to do to you and your baby, I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent. He told her the combination to the safe before hanging up abruptly. A new plan began to form in Eleanor's mind, one that was far more ruthless than simply taking over the company. Richard's desperate gambit had given her an opening, a chance not just to win, but to annihilate. A few days later, a message was delivered to Chloe Rain via a discreet courier. It wasn't from a lawyer. It was a handwritten note on Eleanor's personal stationery. It contained a simple plane ticket, a one-way first-class seat to Zurich departing in 3 days, and a key to a safe deposit box at Credit Suisse. The note read, Chloe Richard will not protect you. When this is over, he will have nothing, and he will blame you. He will leave you with nothing but legal bills and a ruined reputation. I, on the other hand, am offering you a choice. Testify truthfully at the custody hearing about what Richard forced you to do, and this key is yours. The box contains a cashier's check for $5 million and documents for a new identity. Disappear and start a new life. Or perjure yourself and stand by Richard. But know this, I have evidence that will not just ruin him, but will implicate anyone who aided him in criminal conspiracy. Choose wisely. It was a cold, calculated move. Eleanor was using the very tool Richard had taught her to value above all else, leverage. She was giving Chloe a way out, but it was a path that led directly through the heart of Richard's last, desperate plan. The trap was set. Now she just had to wait and see if Chloe was smart enough to save herself by walking right into it. The day of the custody hearing arrived with a cold, biting wind that seemed to mirror the atmosphere inside the family courthouse. The room was packed, a grim theatre filled with lawyers, a handful of reporters who'd caught wind of the high-stakes drama, and Richard Sterling, who sat beside Julian Croft, looking coiled and venomous. He believed this was his moment of vengeance, the stage where he would publicly brand Eleanor as an unfit mother. He had no idea he was walking into his own execution. Eleanor entered the courtroom with David Chen. She exuded an aura of unshakable calm, her pregnancy no longer a perceived vulnerability, but a symbol of her strength. She moved with purpose, her head held high, ignoring the stares and whispered comments. The proceedings began, and Julian Croft launched into a theatrical, aggressive opening statement, painting Eleanor as a Machiavellian schemer whose actions were detrimental to the well-being of her unborn child. He spoke of her manic ambition and emotional instability. It was a masterclass in character assassination. When it was his turn, David Chen was brief and methodical. Your Honor, he said calmly, the petitioner's claims are not only baseless, they are a malicious and calculated abuse of the court system, designed to harass a woman in the final stages of her pregnancy. We will not only prove these allegations false, but will also expose the petitioner's own conduct as demonstrably and criminally unfit. The first witness Croft called was Chloe Rain. She walked to the stand looking pale and nervous. She avoided looking at both Richard and Eleanor. Richard watched her with a smug, confident expression, believing she was about to deliver the testimony that would cripple his wife. Ms. Raincroft began, "Could you please describe Miss Sterling's behavior in the weeks leading up to the gala?" Chloe took a deep breath. She glanced for a fleeting second at Eleanor, who gave her the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. That was all it took. Eleanor, Mrs. Sterling was a model of grace and composure. Chloe said, her voice shaky but clear. The smug look on Richard's face vanished, replaced by stunned disbelief. She was under immense personal stress, which I now know was caused by her husband's infidelity. "With me?" Croft sputtered. "Your Honor, this witness is being hostile." "She's answering the question," the judge said dryly. "Proceed," Chloe continued, her voice gaining strength. "The affidavit I signed was false. Every word of it. I was coerced into signing it by Richard Sterling. He threatened to ruin me professionally and financially if I didn't. He told me exactly what to write. Eleanor never drank. She was never hysterical. She was strong. The only person who was unstable and out of control was Richard." She then detailed how Richard had laid out the entire scheme, how he'd reveled in the idea of hurting Eleanor, how he'd promised to take care of Chloe if she played her part. It was a complete and total recantation. Richard was staring at her, his mouth opening and closing silently, his face turning a dark, mottled red. He had been betrayed by the one person he thought he still controlled. When David Chen cross-examined Chloe, his questions were simple and devastating. "Ms. Rain, did Mr. Sterling ever mention a black ledger?" "Yes," she said. "He called it his insurance. He said it contained details of illegal payments." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge banged her gavel for order. And finally, Ms. Rain David said, "Why are you choosing to tell the truth now?" Chloe looked at the judge, her eyes welling with tears that seemed genuine. "Because what I did was wrong, and what he is trying to do to a woman carrying his own child is monstrous. I won't be a part of it anymore." After Chloe's testimony, Richard's case was in ashes. The judge dismissed the custody motion with prejudice, scathingly rebuking Richard and his counsel for wasting the court's time with such a transparently vindictive and fraudulent claim. But Eleanor wasn't finished. As a stunned Richard and a furious Julian Croft tried to exit the courthouse, they were met in the hallway, not by paparazzi, but by 2 FBI agents and a detective from the district attorney's office. Richard Sterling, one of the agents said, flashing a badge. "You're under arrest." Standing behind them was Liam Richards' former assistant and Eleanor, holding a black moleskin notebook. Liam had not only told her the combination, but he had also retrieved the ledger from Richard's home office and brought it to her. The final scene of the drama did not play out in a boardroom, but in the sterile hallway of a courthouse. Richard stared at the ledger in Eleanor's hands, then at Liam's guilt-ridden but resolute face, and finally at Eleanor. The hatred in his eyes was pure, but it was overshadowed by the profound soul-crushing agony of total defeat. He had been outmaneuvered at every turn. He had underestimated her intelligence, her resilience, and her ruthlessness. He had thought he was a king, but he was just a con-man who had married a queen and forgotten her power. As the agents cuffed him and read him his rights, he had one last thing to say. He looked at Eleanor, his voice a venomous whisper. "You will regret this, Ellie." Eleanor looked at the man she had once loved. Now, a common criminal, being led away in disgrace, she felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, not even pity. She simply felt free. She placed a hand on her belly. "No, Richard," she said softly to herself as much as to him. "I'm just getting started." She turned, leaving the wreckage of her old life behind, and walked out into the sunshine, ready to build her new one. Eleanor Sterling didn't just win, she redefined victory. She transformed from a society wife into a titan of industry, raising her son while fearlessly leading Auratech into a new era of innovation and ethical leadership. She proved that a woman's power isn't something given to her by a man, but something she claims for herself. Her story is a testament to the fact that the deepest betrayals can forge the strongest resolve, and that the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous. Richard Sterling faded into a cautionary tale, a name whispered in headlines about fraud and corruption before being forgotten entirely. But Eleanor Vance, the mother, the CEO, the visionary, became a legend. Her story reminds us that when you push someone to the brink, you might just push them onto a throne. What did you think of Eleanor's incredible journey? Let us know in the comments below. If this story of justice and empowerment resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable real-life dramas.